What a lot of people don't realize is that for a lot of us modern historians, when we go out there and we study history, we quite often are drawn further to the past. In my case, it was towards ancient history. Sometimes we start in the medieval period, sometimes we start a bit earlier, because the reality is you don't understand the sculpture unless you look at the bedrock that it's built on. Now, for that reason, and for that reason alone, I undertook a minor when I did my degree for history, where I studied specifically ancient history. But the thing is, ancient history doesn't really work on YouTube when it goes on a lot of channels. Because a lot of channels that cover modern history, well, it doesn't feed the information and the videos of ancient history to that modern audience, because YouTube gods work that way. And for that reason, and for that reason alone, welcome to the Ancient Connection, a new channel where I can talk about ancient history with a co-host who will upload periodically. And see, the thing about ancient history and channels that discuss them, and well, media in general, is that more often than not, they tend to stick to things that please larger audiences. Think like the Romans, or believe it or not, the Romans, and would you believe, the Romans. But see, the fun thing about starting a new channel on YouTube is that for the first dozen or so videos, you can write whatever you like. You can talk about whatever you want, because you don't have to worry about an algorithm. You can just have fun. It's liberating. And for that reason, we're going to kick things off with something a little left field that we don't really see much in modern discourse outside of, insane people on TikTok pretending it was aliens. We're going to talk about the collapse of the Maya, and how it's oddly specifically relevant to our current day and age. The collapse of the Maya civilization, why and how it happened, is one of those perplexing and fascinating historical questions that everyone has an opinion on. Now, sometimes those opinions are made by Hollywood, and you should ignore them completely, looking at you, Apocalypto, and half at TikTok, but others, well, they're worth exploring. See, the Mayans, they flourished as a civilization for more than 1,000 years across present-day southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. They built one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas, a culture that in many ways was so complex that it can easily be compared to European counterparts. Now that's going to seriously upset a certain group of people on the internet, but I stand by it. The Maya developed a complex writing system, advanced mathematics, and monumental architecture, along with intricate calendars that tracked astronomical cycles with precision. Yet between the 8th and 10th centuries AD, many of the great Maya cities in the southern lowlands entered a period of dramatic decline. Monument building ceased and populations dwindled. Several city-states that had thrived for centuries were abandoned, sometimes relatively abruptly. But why? And is there any truth to this in what we actually know through archaeological evidence, or is it all just made-up mythos? See, a lot of earlier scholars frame this decline as sudden and mysterious, calling it a collapse, and indeed, this video in fact is called Collapse because that's the common nomenclature. But modern research paints a far more nuanced picture. The process was neither instantaneous nor uniform across the Mayan world. Instead, the so-called collapse was an extended, regionally varied transformation, influenced by economics, politics, environment, and many social factors. Now, understanding this collapse requires examining the centuries-long trajectory of Maya growth, and that can take a very long time, so we're going to do this very quickly. And we're going to look at the stresses that accumulated within their society, and how those vulnerabilities came to the surface, causing internal and external pressures to rip the civilization apart. In short, the truth is not some insane conspiracy theory where aliens come down to blow the civilization to bits and steal all the people. What happened to the Mayans is actually pretty normal, and it can happen again. Before examining the decline, it is essential to understand the context of the Maya at their height. See, classic Maya civilization lasts from about 250 to 900 AD, and it's characterized by urbanized city-states such as Tikal, Palang, Calakmul, Copan, and Caracol. Yeah, I said all those wrong. These cities were not unified under a single empire. Instead, they formed a network of competing kingdoms that forged alliances, fought wars, and conducted trade. They developed distinct artistic and political traditions by themselves. Think this as being closer to the ancient Greek polis rather than the Roman Empire. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, that kind of thing. Maya kings were known as the Jaw, and they positioned themselves as divine intermediaries between the earthly realm and the supernatural world. Monumental architecture, including pyramids and palaces, served not only as centres of political administration, but as also stages for ritual performances. Stelae carved with hieroglyphic inscriptions celebrate royal lineages, victories, and cosmic events. Think, transit of Venus, comets, things like that. and this embedded political authority in a sacred narrative. Like I said, this was a highly complex and organised civilization. This civilization, like many other ancient ones though, relied heavily on agricultural production, and this was mostly things like maize, beans and squash, cultivated through a mixture of slash and burn methods, and in certain cities more intensive terracing and water management systems, think almost like an aqueduct sort of system. As population centres grew, elites oversaw increasingly elaborate rituals, trade networks expanded, and naturally this led to warfare between the city-states. But by the mid-8th century though, the southern lowlands were home to a dense population supported by these advanced agricultural practices, and as with all civilizations, after a period of growth, a steep decline set in. The Maya didn't just up and abandon their cities one day. Rather, the seeds of the collapse were visible long before the widespread abandonment of the cities. Around the mid-8th century, inscriptions and archaeological evidence indicate rising political instability. Monument erection, which had been steady for centuries, began to stagnate or decline at several major centres, and artefacts that recorded royal celebrations or victories would become less and less frequent. And this suggests that something was happening that led to dynasties faltering in power or reduced resources for elite display. Simultaneously, evidence of warfare increased, fortifications appeared in some cities, and the discovery of mass burial sites suggests violent conflicts, and as iconography depicting war captives became more common. Such warfare was not new to the Mayan culture, but the frequency and intensity appears to have escalated. Dynastic rivalries appear to have also intensified, as the political landscape became increasingly fragmented, and this disrupted trade routes, further weakening intercity alliances and leading to even more conflict. Environmental stress also began to mount, possibly leading to political instability, as paleoclimate data from lake sediment and cave stalagmites and other sources reveal a pattern that there was a series of prolonged droughts in the region between 750 and 900 AD. While earlier generations of Maya had weathered drought cycles before, this was not new. The combination of a demographic saturation, agricultural intensification, and severe political instability, likely being caused by a feedback loop with each of these events causing the other one to get worse, made the society less resilient to the climate changing. One of the most widely accepted and contributing factors to the Maya collapse is the environmental degradation, particularly deforestation and soil exhaustion. See, the agricultural demands of a rapidly growing population that's estimated to have reached several million people across the lowlands, it was placing insane pressure on the dirt to grow the crops. And remember how I said the Mayans often relied on slash and burn agriculture? Well, this required leaving fields to fallow in order to regenerate nutrients. Think of it as a sort of natural fertilizer. As populations expanded, cities grew, and arable land would become more and more scarce. Fallow cycles were then shortened in a short-term fix to fix the food problem, but all this did was degrade soil fertility. Deforestation, especially around major cities, would then contribute to erosion, and this reduced the land's ability to retain moisture, which then started to cause water problems. And then without tree cover, local rainfall patterns may also have been affected as more and more land was cleared. Compounding the effects of drought, this led to another problem: water. See, water management was crucial in the lowlands, where rivers are sparse and rainfall is seasonal. So we've already got an issue where water is not being held through the soil due to erosion. So many cities would then construct reservoirs, canals, and terraced fields to store and regulate water. But these systems required constant maintenance. And during periods of stress, be it warfare or political upheaval, labour shortages became common. And labour shortages meant that these water systems may have faltered, which causes water scarcity, which further compounds the food issue. You're starting to see how this is becoming a massive feedback loop. As the population grew, the crops started to fail. The population would have been left therefore hungry, and this would have led to rulers to seek out war and other means to secure their food supplies at the cost of their neighbours. And this again begins a cycle that is utterly devastating to the civilization as a whole, because you can't grow crops when there are armies marching through them. Without being here for a year, the basic political structure of the classic Maya world was based wholly on independent city-states ruled by hereditary kings, and this was inherently vulnerable to systemic collapse. See, elites depended on ritual performance, warfare victories, and access to prestige gods to legitimize their rule. When drought, famine, and population pressure disrupted this, and the economics started to slow down, well, the foundations of their power, their connection to the Almighties, the gods, well, it started to fall apart too, because you can't be connected to the gods and be the chosen one if everything is falling apart. Archaeological evidence suggests that the royal dynasty started to fall apart throughout the southern lowlands during this period because of this. Inscriptions that previously celebrate major events cease to appear, and this indicates that rulers are either being deposed, killed, or they just simply couldn't afford to commission monuments. which is a sign that things are very, very bad. In some cities, palaces were looted or burned, providing direct evidence of political upheaval. This matches up with events we discussed earlier. As local rulers lost control, the centralised governance systems that coordinated labour for agriculture, we were talking about this before, like construction and water management, well, they would have deteriorated too, and without this leadership, these cities could no longer sustain large populations. Residents gradually, or sometimes abruptly, would have to abandon the urban centres in search for food, most likely moving to rural areas where they could engage in subsistence farming. Now, this is a common occurrence in famines. Only have a look at what the population in Ukraine and the Kazakhs and the Caucasus tried to do during the 1930s, during the Soviet man-made famines. They desperately went searching for food. And that led to complete abandonment of villages and parts of cities, although the Soviet forces obviously, at gunpoint, stopped them from moving. Trade had long been essential to the Maya as well. See obsidian from the highlands, salt from the northern Yucatan, textiles, cacao beans, and so many other goods, and they moved along extensive established trade routes connecting the Maya world with distant cultures such as the Mexican cultures further north, and further cultures further south into Central and South America. During the classical period, these trade routes became increasingly unstable due to warfare and political fragmentation. And as the central cities and the southern cities began to lose influence, you could see the regional trade hubs start to shift, bypassing these southern towns. The rise of northern centres such as Chichen Itza during the Terminal Classic from 800 to 1000 AD suggests that trade patterns reorganised completely around the new political and economic powers, completely cutting off the southern lowlands, previously the heartland of the Mayans, from the northern cities. And it's causing further and further marginalisation, which leads to the further worsening of the feedback loop. As economic opportunities diminished, social hierarchy would have grown strained. Artisans and scribes and workers who depended on patronage would have lost their livelihoods and become just more mouths to feed. And on top of that, the decline of trade would have also undermined interregional relationships, and so war would have become more and more common as things got worse. Now, there is one other factor that we haven't discussed yet, and it's not really documented, so we don't know whether it played a part, but it would not be too shocking. It is possible that disease may have played a role here. See, densely populated cities with limited sanitation would have been increasingly vulnerable to epidemics, especially during periods of famine, as immune systems upon the people there would have become weaker and weaker and weaker. And while no specific pathogen has ever been identified, it is possible, when we look at other pre-modern societies, that disease could have contributed to a sharp population decline within the region. Archaeological evidence does show, though, that palaces began to be burned more and more, and that there were hastily built barricades and little walls inside cities and redoubts that show that there were likely large-scale riots and civil wars within city-states. As the status quo was shattered, a large-scale migration would be triggered, and the water scarcity at its core would have been one of the biggest reasons for this alone, let alone the food issue, let alone the war, let alone any of the other myriad of issues that was likely going on. The cities in the southern lowlands just were not tenable, so we started to see more and more people move and migrate to the north towards the Yucatan Peninsula and the highlands of Guatemala. The migration ultimately changed everything. The northern cities, such as Chichen Itza, like I mentioned, Uxmal, and later Mayapan, grew immensely during this period in what is called the post-classical Mayan era. And these centres exhibited new architectural styles, political structures, and cultural influences. And it reflects a complete shift in Mayan society from the southern lowland city-state model to a more centralised, more modernised military state influenced by outside traditions. I want to kind of compare this to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in this sense. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the East still lived, and we saw the centre of gravity move from not really Rome in that case, more Ravenna and Milan or Mediolanum, to the east towards Constantinople. It was an adjustment, but it wasn't a complete destruction. This regional variability demonstrates, as like with the Romans, the collapse of the Maya was not the end of its civilization, rather a transformation, as millions of Mayan people continued to live across Mesoamerica, and they preserved languages and traditions and agricultural practices that in some cases actually survive to this day. And although collapse, like I said, suggests a total disappearance, like the Romans following the end of the Western Empire, the Maya did not vanish. Instead, the demographic and cultural centre of gravity shifted. Writing and monumental architecture declined in some regions, but has persisted in modified forms in others. And the post-classic Maya did stay on. They did exist. They kept going. At least until the Spanish appeared, in which case there was, and we can confirm this, major pestilence. Understanding the collapse as a transformation rather than a disappearance allows for a more accurate interpretation of what's going on here with Maya history, and it highlights just how resilient cultures and civilizations can be, especially if they are highly organized ones. Furthermore, it underscores how societies have to face, no matter how developed they think they are, environmental and political pressures. And it kills the myth, the moment we are educated on this, it kills the myth that is pushed by morons that claim it was some kind of major conspiracy or aliens. I'm not going to say who I'm referring to in particular, but you can take 3 guesses on the internet. I just don't want to get sued because they're quite litigious. Societies do collapse. The Maya are no different to what could happen to any other civilized society out there. They just got very unlucky. So what is the truth? Well, no single explanation fully accounts for the Maya collapse, and it's possible that I've been completely wrong here. We can only go on the evidence that we have on hand. However, historians and archaeologists increasingly view that as the outcome of multiple interacting factors. No empire, no country falls for one reason. It is due to a combination of environmental stress, population pressure, political instability, warfare and economic disruption, and social upheaval that created an ongoing crisis. Now, each factor alone may not have been catastrophic for the Mayans, but together they produced a cascading failure that overwhelmed the classical Mayan framework in the southern regions of the civilization. Climate change, for instance, not the whole world's climate is changing, more a local, regional, El Niño, La Niña kind of situation, made agriculture difficult, which likely led to a famine, which intensified warfare over resources, which then undermined political authority, which then prevented maintenance of water management systems, and which may have then led to the outbreak of disease. And the collapse in many ways can be considered, therefore, like I've been saying, a feedback loop rather than a chain of events. And these events carry valuable lessons for contemporary societies. It illustrates just how advanced civilizations can become vulnerable when demographic pressure and environmental degradation and political instability all converge on one point. It shows that societies built on rigid hierarchies may struggle to adapt quickly to changing conditions. The Maya had developed sophisticated methods of agriculture and water control, but their political system may have lacked the flexibility to respond effectively to prolonged droughts and shifting economic dynamics, and so as the civilization grew and flourished, it unknowingly sowed the seeds of its own destruction. At the same time, the Maya collapse highlights just how resilient humans can be. They adapted, they migrated, they reorganized, they rebuilt themselves, and their descendants still exist because of that. And that is the end of our story, and the beginning of showing just how connected the ancient world is to our modern day. I hope you all enjoyed the first installment on this new channel, and I hope you join us on The Ancient Connection. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time.